tragically in February 2010. It's great to see so many of you here, and thank you for your patience waiting in the lobby to join the lecture. This is a 10th anniversary lecture, and we're especially delighted that a member of David's family could join us. Marta is here, and welcome Marta too, and you all. One of the pleasures among many of the lecture is that it's a chance for old friends of David, colleagues, speakers as well of the lecture to come together, catch up, reminisce also about David, share memories in the picture gallery at RHUL Holloway. We can't do that obviously, but I hope there'll be a chance for us all to come together in conversation at the end of the lecture, time permitting. Okay, I'd like to pass over immediately to Professor Giuliana Pieri, the head of the School of Humanities and fellow CVC member, who will now introduce our speaker. Giuliana.
Thank you very much, James, and I'd really like to sort of thank you, James, actually for organising this event and for being such a sort of sort of active director of the Centre for Visual Cultures, which is, it's been a real sort of pleasure to see all the activities over the past few years. And thank you very much for kind of organising and hosting the event. As James said, this lecture marks the 10th anniversary of the tragic and untimely death of our dear colleague, Professor David Vilaseca. David was an authority on Spanish and Catalan culture and also an award-winning Catalan writer. It's really interesting thinking about David's publications and his interests. I was thinking, one of the central concerns for him was the idea of identity as an unstable entity, but also the idea of the exploration of the boundaries between self and other. So it seems to me particularly apt, really, to introduce Professor Joanna Zylinska, and I'm sort of particularly really sort of pleased to welcome her, because in her lecture tonight, I think she will help us to understand the kind of role and position of the human and also creativity in relation to artificial intelligence. And this is particularly sort of linked to Joanna's most recent book. And I thought that, one of the most wonderful things about the book is, some of the really important questions that she asks, and hopefully we'll be able to discuss some of these issues tonight. So what are the conditions of art making and creativity today? Can computers be creative? How do we make sense of artworks that use artificial intelligence? And perhaps tonight we might even touch, as Joanna does in her book so well, on the kind of future of art or future art, what is in store for us in the future. Joanna is a professor of new media and communications at Goldsmiths, and I'm particularly delighted that she will address us tonight because she combines her exacting work on media theory with her practice, and this is both curatorial practice and also practice as an artist. She works on digital culture, artificial intelligence, photography, but also ethics. She's an incredibly prolific writer. I don't know how she fits everything into her days, but I just want to mention the most recent volumes, which really sort of speak very powerfully to the kind of wide breadth of her interests. In 2014, she published a monograph on entitled Minimal Ethics for the Anthropocene. In 2017, followed another book entitled Nonhuman Photography. And then the following year, another very important book entitled The End of Man, a Feminist Counterapocalypse. And then finally, in 2020, just more or less hot off the press, really in this most extraordinary year, her book entitled AI, Art, Machine Visions and Warped Dreams. And Joanna, the title of Joanna's lecture tonight is AI, Photography and I. And please join me in welcoming Joanna.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Thank you for such a generous introduction. And I would like to begin by thanking everyone and Professor James Williams and his colleagues at the Centre for Visual Cultures at Royal Holloway for inviting me. And I'm honoured to be delivering the annual David Vilaseca Memorial Lecture. A few words of introduction from my side. So as well as being a scholar, writer and media theorist, I'm also a photographer in the sense that I have a photographic practice. I think about and with images as part of my academic work. But then aren't we all photographers today in one way or another? Let me just share a screen with you. And is this working okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, okay. So the question is like, what does it even mean, me saying that I am a photographer? Aren't we all photographers? If we were in different circumstances, I could ask you to show me your phones and I could try and peer into the flow of images that you've no doubt accumulated through, your own making a lot of the time. Although even though you do probably take photographs on a daily basis, or at least you did at the time when you used to go out into the streets, that doesn't mean you necessarily think of yourself as a photographer. Yet photographic activity has become part of our kind of everyday kind of way of being in the world, taking notes, taking memos, sending things to people as part of a digital touch. So the definition of a photographer has been radically transformed today as a result of the deluge of images and imaging practices. Also interesting, the majority of images produced today are not really made by machine, but with a human viewer in mind. They are made by machines and for other machines. So contrary to what the title of my lecture suggests, this lecture is not really about me. The I here rather stands for subjectivity. And not just mine, but more broadly, human subjectivity, which means the cognitive and corporeal sense of the human, and the way it is being shaped and altered today by both photography and AI. My title also includes a homophone, so my lecture is going to be about the I as opposed to you, although it's going to be about you as much as about me, but it's also about the eye as opposed to an ear, so it's going to be about the seeing apparatus. And in relation to this kind of I as a subjectivity, which is as much visual as it is oral, and how this all relates to images that we're both producing and being produced by, we have become today what the Royal Holloway professor Olga Goriunova calls digital subjects. And a couple of pictures illustrate this point. So this is me at an exhibition on AI at the Barbican last year, although I'm doing my best to fail at this digital subjectivity being misrecognized by an algorithm on the basis of my basically non-existent data footprint from my social media. It was trying to reach through my Facebook, was trying to reach through my Twitter, didn't find anything, and this is what it said. It was a kind of failure and a success at the same time. I'm sorry, I'm going the wrong direction. Okay, and this is me being misrecognized as a human by the kind of YOLO algorithm. And having said that, the majority of other visitors to the gallery were getting the scores around 90% as a person. So that was kind of interesting as well. So to sum up this introduction, my lecture today will discuss the role of photographs and other mechanically produced images and the associated data in the construction of our own identity and self-image as individual subjects, as workers, as students, as citizens, in the age of increasing automation of many spheres of life. The technology of AI will be seen as key to this automation, and the lecture picks up on some threads from my newly published book, AI Art. So a big shout out here to my colleagues at Open Humanities Press, which is a scholar-led non-profit publishing collective, which is designed to making the works of critical theory available for free. So I would invite you to go and explore the openhumanities.org website, because there is many more free books and all sorts of kind of cultural subjects. Okay, so now onto the lecture proper. Let me give you a few examples of the coming together of photography, image making, and AI today. In July 2018, the camera manufacturer Huawei held a photographic competition that was judged by photographer Alex Lambrechts and a Huawei P20 Pro AI smartphone. Building on its previous claims that Huawei P20 was equipped with master AI, whatever that means, which automatically set the most optimum camera mode for every situation, as well as learning to adapt to user behavior, the Chinese AI-powered flagship wasn't just making photos, but also evaluating them, using its artificial intelligence to rate the thousands of images alongside a professional Leica photographer. So here are the results. So you can see that AI, according to Huawei, clearly likes color orange and sunsets. Now, of course, this competition was clearly a PR campaign intended to promote AI as a supposed feature of their advanced model phones. But we've recently seen the emergence of many automatically generated images that have relied on AI for their production, with an algorithm partly taking on the role of the artist. So this outpouring of computer-made creative artifacts has been taking place against the unfolding of public interest in artificial intelligence, from fascination with its creative capabilities to anxiety related to the impending automation of the labor force, or even the possible annihilation of the human species. Now, the stories and claims regarding supposed machine creativity and machine vision that accompany the emergence of those artifacts are at least as interesting for me as the artifacts themselves. But I want to discuss the relationship between artificial intelligence and mechanical image making, including photography, in a way that goes beyond the frequently posed question, can computers be creative? I will still attempt to answer this question while arguing why this may not be the best question to ask about AI. Along the way, I will formulate many alternative questions in an attempt to challenge the binary logic of much of current thinking on AI. But questioning won't be the only thing I'll do. My talk will also entail a critique, which shouldn't be treated as a kind of repudiation of AI or in fact, I'm deeply fascinated by the technical and cultural possibilities of artificial intelligence. And I'm kind of intrigued by the claims and promises made in its name by developers, investors, and commentators. But with this, I want to offer a more nuanced position on understanding our relationship with technology. So instead of pitching the human against the machine, I propose to see different forms of human activity, including photography, and other forms of image making as having always been technical, and thus also, to some extent, artificially intelligent. So my critique will primarily focus on the political underpinnings of AI. The exploration of the problem of machine vision in current AI research will lead me to raise broader questions about different ways of seeing, invisibility, and perception across various platforms and scales. So the way I want to accomplish all this today is by bringing into a conversation artist Trevor Paglen's understanding of photography in terms of seeing machines with my own earlier work on non-human photography to probe the algorithmic aspect of perception and vision across apparatuses, species, and timescales. The rationale for this conversation is an attempt on my part to imagine better ways of seeing the world at a time when it's being reshaped by the discourses and practices of artificial intelligence and machine vision. But it's also an attempt to envisage better ways of acting in the world. So there is an ethical dimension to what I'm doing, building on some of my earlier work. But this is also a pedagogic dimension. For philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, whose work has been very important for my understanding of ethics, an ethical relationship with the other, in as much as it's welcomed, can be understood precisely in terms of teaching, as a way of bringing me more than I can contain. And last but not least, the goal of my talk is to ask questions about the actual spaces and institutions where thinking and learning about technology, image making, and creativity takes place. The modern university, the liberal arts college, the art school, also spaces like the Center for Visual Cultures. So this talk is also about the way photography, visual culture, and art education look today, and the way we want them to look in the future. Words about Paglen now. In his image-based practice, Trevor Paglen interrogates how we see the world, focusing on the way in which the logic of total transparency promoted by the socio-political apparatus translates into global surveillance, while also creating zones of opacity that hide the actual operations of power. His recent experiments with AI open up an interesting way of thinking about computation in relation to photography. Over the last 10 years or so, claims Paglen, powerful algorithms and artificial intelligence networks have enabled computers to see autonomously. This leads him to ask, what does it mean that seeing no longer requires a human seer in the loop? Paglen points out that the majority of images produced today are not only generated automatically without human intentionality or oversight, but that they are also intended for a non-human recipient, this or that section of the planetary computational system that Benjamin Bratton has deemed the stack. Paglen has in mind here photographs produced via face recognition technology that are increasingly used in policing, surveillance and access cameras, computer vision directing the self-driving cars, or cameras on drones used to allow the algorithm driving killer robots to determine worthy targets. His project, it began as a military experiment, included in his exhibition at Metro Pictures in New York in 2017, features rows of color portrait photographs showing seemingly regular subjects of different genders, ethnicities, and ages. Only a very close look allows the viewer to detect grid-like white symbols, which have been superimposed on the subjects' faces. The photos had been drawn from a database containing thousands of photos of people, many of them workers at a military base in Maryland, which had been collected on behest of DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the people who invented the internet, basically, to help develop facial recognition technology, or, well, sponsor the invention of the internet at universities. Anyway, to do this, the military needed to train the algorithm in pattern recognition by feeding it thousands of faces and teaching it to recognize variations between them. So Paglen spent months going through the Ferret database to select individual images, which he then retouched and color corrected. These images are actually not aimed at human eyes. As a training set for the facial recognition algorithm, their goal is to establish commonality in difference for machine vision. And it's precisely the impossibility of knowing what's in the database, not only through the lack of access, but also through the sheer physical impossibility on the part of humans to sift through the data sets that drives Paglen's work. Now, his project Sight Machine, which was a collaboration with Kronos Quartet and light installation company Obscura Digital, involved staging a concert in a San Francisco warehouse and then was restaged at the Barbican last year, accompanied by projecting on the screen behind them various bits of data using AI algorithms. So Paglen had installed a number of cameras in the warehouse with feeds going into the video mixer. The cameras then made visible on the screen behind the band outlines of human members of the band and their supposed emotions. The occasional turning of the camera on the audience allowed them to see themselves being seen by computers, with their faces recognized as faces by computer-generated rectangles. The idea was to examine the architectures of different computer vision systems by trying to learn what it was that they were seeing. Yet is it actually still seeing? And are we still talking about intelligence? Or are they just things that look like intelligence or sight? Echoing a quip that is popular among AI researchers, can the submarine swim? These questions are important because the systems put in motion that enable computer vision and other forms of AI determine what or who is allowed in and what or who isn't. Much translation work is therefore involved in Paglen's Sight Machine, but at the end of the day, the project reveals fundamental untranslatability of data across human and non-human platforms. So the work therefore succeeds and fails at the same time. It fails at transparency, at revealing what machines see, but it succeeds at revealing an epistemological and ontological gap. Or in other words, it fails the lack of understanding of the problem of sight not just in machines, but also at the end of the day in humans. So the project also fails that classic Marxian promise that revealing the conditions of injustice would lead to political activity and liberation. And indeed, that promise has been put to rest by responses to much of the activity of platform capitalism. It would be, of course, naive to suggest that people don't know that, for example, Google is spying on us, or that Facebook mines our personal data for commercial gain. Yet what Paglen unveils is precisely the fact that vision itself is changing, that we can't ever truly see, and that a new network of visuality has the potential to radically redefine what counts as visible and what doesn't, or what or who counts, full stop. So we can therefore conclude that Paglen's work reveals the impossibility of seeing it all on the part of the human, while also demonstrating how the link between seeing and knowing has ultimately been severed in the algorithmic culture that organizes our social and political lives. And yet, as with his previous projects, there is something romantically futile about this artistic gesture, premised as it is on unveiling the machinations of the stack. And to say this is not to dismiss his artistic undertakings, but rather to suggest that the success of Paglen's work lies in its paragonal nature. To really get what he's showing, we need to engage not just with the images he produces, but also with the narrative about machine vision, the human intervention into the limits of the image, and the discourse about art making. So the term paragon, referring to a supplementary remark, additional material, or an ornament whose function is merely to embellish the main work, the ergon, has been immortalized in art theory by Jacques Derrida. In his reading of Kant's critique of judgment in The Truth in Painting, Derrida takes issue with the idea of a self-contained nature of the work of art, expressed in the notion of the intrinsic value and beauty it supposedly possesses. And so he undermines that by literally bringing in the work's framing into the picture. So the supposed secondary function of the framing of the paragon is revealed to be foundational to the artwork's existence and recognition as an artwork. It demarcates it, but also gives it identity separated from what it's not. So for Derrida, a work of art is never self-contained. It always depends on its paraga, literal ones, frames, ornaments, but also commentaries, to be recognized in its supposed uniqueness and singularity. And thus to say that Paglen's work is paragonal is not to criticize it for its supposed lack, but rather to acknowledge its perhaps knowing reliance on the grid, the network, the cloud, the explanation, the engagement with the engineering discourse. In other words, Paglen's project on seeing machines mobilize human intelligence and machinic technology to teach us something, while also revealing our own cognitive and political limits and blind spots. His practice doesn't amount to producing political art per se, but it does engage our sense and sensibility to reprogram the human cognitive sensory apparatus. And seeing machines is actually a term used by Paglen to describe the contemporary condition of photography. In a series of blog posts written in 2014, he proposed an expanded understanding of the photographic medium, encompassing the myriad ways that not only humans use technology to see the world, but the ways machines see the world for other machines. His definition includes various image capturing apparatuses, from cell phones through to satellite cameras, but also incorporates data storage systems, interpretation algorithms, and last but not least, the technologies of perception that emerge as part of the networked photographic practices, and that establish and legitimate our regimes of visibility. Most importantly, the notion of photography as seeing machines highlights the fact that to focus too closely on individual images today is to entirely miss the point. So with this argument, Paglen offers a blow to the art historical and journalistic understanding of photography in terms of singular historical records and framed artifacts. It's not even that digital technology has resulted in the supposed overproduction of images today, with singular photographs giving way to image and data flows. Again, think about the Instagram flow or the flow of photographs on your mobile phone. So it's rather that photographs are part of the wider technological network of production and perception. They are both objects to be looked at and vision-shaping technologies for humans and machines. Their identity as discrete images is therefore performatively established by the very acts of looking at them. But we must bear in mind that the looker is not always human. Now, there is an affinity between Paglen's conceptualization of photography in terms of seeing machine and my notion of non-human photography developed in a previous book. And I argued there about the inadequacy of the traditional photography theory for analyzing the image landscape today, because, as Paglen points out, Susan Sontag's seminal work has little to say about the infrared imaging system on a Reaper drone, while applying Roland Barthes' ideas to the billions of images in London's citywide surveillance archives would be utterly absurd. So the concept of non-human photography refers to photographs that are not of, by, or for the human. The notion encompasses images as diverse as depopulated vistas, satellite images, and QR codes. And even though the opening premise of my book's argument was that today, in the age of CCTV, drone media, medical body scans, and satellite imaging, photography has been increasingly decoupled from human agency and human vision, I also suggested that even those images that have been taken by the human entail a non-human element. This element, executed by means of technical and cultural algorithms, is revealed by the fact that most people's wedding photographs, holiday snapshots, or indeed Instagram feeds look very similar. So the recognition of this cultural iterability allowed me to suggest that humans have always been technological. And I've been thinking here, for those of you who are more philosophically inclined, with people like Bernard Stiegler or Gilbert Simondon. My concept of non-human photography arguably goes further than Paglen's idea of seeing machines, because it not only studies humans as seen by machines, or machines that see things outside the human spectrum, but also because it understands humans as seeing machines, but not in a mechanical Cartesian way. And last but not least, this notion of non-human photography reaches towards geological past, with the universe positioned as a giant camera, making photoimagistic impressions on a variety of surfaces, from rocks through to skin. Yet rather than enter into a terminological competition with Paglen, whose work I greatly admire, I'm more interested in bringing his theory of machinic sight into a conversation with my own work to envisage better ways of seeing the world and acting in it. While acknowledging that both seeing and acting will be undertaken by human and non-human agents, the reflective process on what constitutes the goodness and what forms it may take, and also on the competing claims as to its validity, will be uniquely human. So there is still a role for the human in that kind of human, non-human setup. So to develop this point, I want to offer a new conceptual figuration, undigital photography. Now, the term undigital photography is not fully mine. I have borrowed it from the academic discipline of computational photography, a field which deals with images captured and processed by means of digital computation, rather than as a result of optical processes. So undigital photography is the alternative name given to this new field in which the snap is only the start, and where changes to focus, lighting, framing, or depth of field can take place after the image has been taken. Now, it goes without saying that computation has been part of mechanical image making for a long time. We can think here of Photoshop or internal processing of JPEGs or even RAW images by various digital cameras. But what changes with computational photography is the inherent instability of the outcome of the imaging process, with its openness to manipulation constituting the very ontology of the undigital image, and not just a possibility. conceptual and poetic promise for rethinking our current frameworks and modes of understanding image making as developed in both media theory and visual culture. The term therefore offers new possibilities for thinking photographically in the age of AI. This terminological reinscription is made partly in jest. Its aim is to cut through the smoke and mirrors that surround the discourses of computation and AI. But it's also to raise broader questions about the conditions of image making, creativity, and labor today. Undigital photography recognizes the human history of photography, its artistic legacy, affective attachments, and technological residues. But it repositions the history, this history as premised on events undertaken by human agents along the lines of technical assemblages which also include humans. So it's an attempt to respond to philosopher Willem Flusser's probing question as to what humans can do in a universe driven by geophysical forces which are not of our making, and to explore what forms of creativity, what forms human creativity can take, be it on an artistic, engineering, or political level. Flusser argued that since the times of the Industrial Revolution, image makers have existed in a close-knit relationship with their machines, with their apparatuses, facilitating new kinds of collaborations. Flusser was writing about photographers, yet his argument extends to other forms of human creativity. So this human machinic unity meant for Flusser that humans now function as a function of apparatuses. Their creative activity is therefore understood as an execution of the machine's program and involves making a selection from the range of options determined by the algorithm. We could suggest that this algorithmic constitution of humans started long before the Industrial Revolution, or even that it was foundational to the constitution of the human as a technical being, who actuated this humanness in relation with technical objects such as fire, sticks, and stones. Humans' everyday functioning also depends on the execution of a program, a sequence of possibilities enabled by various couplings of adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine, or DNA. Now, as I argued in Non-Human Photography, this proposition shouldn't be taken as a postulation of a mindless technological or biological determinism that would remove from humans any possibility of action and any responsibility for their actions, for our actions. Yet accepting our affinity with other living beings across the evolutionary spectrum and recognizing that our human lives are subject to biochemical reactions that we can't fully control, from blushing through to aging and dying, does undermine the humanist parameters of the debate about creativity, art, and AI. So disallowing the strict caesura or a gap between humans and machines, our supposed genius and artificial intelligence, such a post-human view of the human recalibrates human creativity as partly computational. Once again, to say this is not to resign ourselves to passivity by concluding that humans are incapable of creating anything, that we are nothing but clockwork devices responding to impulses. I'm not saying that. It's just to concede after Flusser that just as the imagination of the apparatus is greater than that of all artists across history, the imagination of this program called life, in which we all participate, and which is an outcome of multiple processes running across various scales of the universe, far exceeds our human imagination. To understand how humans can operate within the constraints of the apparatus that is part of them becomes a new urgent task for a much-needed post-humanist art theory, and more broadly, for much-needed post-humanities. So in this new paradigm for understanding image making and creativity more broadly, the human would be conceived as part of the machine, dispositive or technical system, and not its sole inventor, owner, and ruler. A post-humanist art history would say instead the production of all artworks, from cave paintings through to the works of so-called great masters and contemporary experiments with all kinds of technologies, as being produced by human artists in an assembly with a plethora of non-human agents, drives, impulses, viruses, drugs, various organic and non-organic substances and devices, as well as all sorts of networks, from mycelium through to the internet. So this frequently posed question, can computers be creative, which I promised to answer at the beginning of my talk while saying this is not the best question, it reveals itself to be rather reductive because it's premised on a pre-technological idea of the human as a standalone subject of decision and action. The computational entity, be it in the shape of a terminator or an algorithm, is only seen here as an imperfect approximation of such a human. So we are better off asking after Flusser whether the human can actually be creative, or more precisely, in what way can the human be creative? So as well as producing a theoretical argument, my contribution to this inquiry has taken the form of a photographic project that has engaged with artificial intelligence. Now, this is a term that Amazon has been informally using to describe its Mechanical Turk platform, which is an online marketplace connecting labor suppliers with providers worldwide. Now, the labor there consists of HITs, human intelligence tasks, usually involving simple mechanical actions performed on digital data, such as tagging photographs or filling in surveys priced very cheaply, from 1/100th of a cent to 1/4 of a cent per task on average. So the project basically puts humans in the role of machines, as it would be too impractical and too expensive to program a computer that would perform such tasks. So I'm going to show you this project and let it play for about a minute. So for my project, I commissioned 100 M-Turkers to take one photo of a view from a window of the room they were in at the time. The instructions clearly stipulated that if there was no window in the room, they should go to the next available room with a window and take a photo from there. They were also asked not to upload stock photos, existing images from the web, or their old photos. I explained that this HIT was for a research and art project which studied human and machine creativity. Post-processing was allowed, though not required. The HIT was priced at double the US living wage per hour, which probably explains why all the tasks had been snapped up and fulfilled almost immediately. Although given that the task was to take 1 to 2 minutes on average, precisely because I wanted a somewhat automatic production of the scene produced by time-poor humans in assembly with their heavily automated phone cameras, it was hardly alleviating world poverty. Indeed, the very act of using M-Turk for this project was not unproblematic and can actually be said to be perpetuating unfair labor conditions worldwide by validating Amazon's platform. The exploration of these conditions also forms the fabric of my project. I don't know where the M-Turkers that responded to my call came from, although it's possible to make some guesses from the images themselves, using signage, architecture, and vegetation as signposts. However, from a 2018 academic study, we learned that most of the M-Turk workers are from the USA, 75%, with India being second, followed by Canada, Great Britain, Philippines, and Germany. Although the composition of a group of available workers at any one time is also clearly dependent on what time it is in different time zones. This is because even though many of the tasks available on the platform are very simple, they require command of the English language to understand and perform them, which puts native and near-native speakers at an advantage. M-Turkers operate anonymously and are only identified through their assigned number, creating an illusion of a fluid mobile labor force that forms part of a digital cloud. So the idea behind my project was to rematerialize the cloudy vapor behind the narrative by creating a group portrait of M-Turkers' locations. Neither conventional portraiture nor landscape photography, the collective image base of view from the window offers instead a non-comprehensive demographic snapshot of the global workforce looking out. The concept and the title return to the mythical first photo in the history of photography, Nicephore Niepce's view from the window at Le Gras. Due to the limited sensitivity of photographic materials, namely the pewter plate covered with bitumen at the time, Niepce's image of a view from a window of his country house in Bourgogne took 8 hours to expose. It's the same picture here. On the left, it's the actual plate. On the right is when the scientists tried to extract some image from it to show us something. So the scene resulted in something which the human eye could never see, with sunlight and shadow being visible on two sides of the buildings at left and right, because it took 8 hours to expose. So this so-called first image in the history of photography therefore presents a distinctly non-human vision, while also enacting a non-human agency at the heart of its production. But it's also for this reason that I chose Niepce's image as a conceptual frame for my MTurk project. The artificial intelligence of Amazon's invisible and distributed labor can therefore be described as undigital, in the sense that, even though it uses digital technology to perform at least partly digital tasks, simulating the work of machines in its quiet efficiency, it also ruptures the seamless narrative of visualization of the machine world. It does this by bringing in the material traces of human bodies and their locations into the picture. Literally, the view from the window shows us that there is a window in the first place, or not. The window is not just a rectangular visualization of the software interface patented by Microsoft and used by other operating systems as part of their user-friendly GUI, but it's also a metal or wooden frame holding a glass pane, but also occasionally curtains, shutters, or mosquito nets that brings in the outside world, while also keeping it at bay, precisely as the outside, the place in which the person looking out is not. And also bear in mind, I did this project in 2018 and wrote about 2019. And obviously now, in a kind of rather uncanny turn of events, we've all found ourselves in a situation where we are hidden behind windows, where we are working, delivering lectures, as the case may be now, and doing all sorts of labors due to the global pandemic from behind that kind of that framing. And that raises serious questions for creativity, for labor, for situation of us as students, as lecturers. And I'll talk about that in a minute. In her provocatively titled book, Artificial Unintelligence, which deals with a misguided belief that computation can solve all complex social problems, Meredith Broussard argues that how you define AI depends on what you want to believe about the future. Yet, unlike Broussard's effort to humanize technology and bring the human back to the center of the technological assembly, my view from the window doesn't aim to simply humanize techne. For me, such a well-meaning effort can only be misguided because it's premised on the severing of the constitutional relationship with technology that the humans always had. But what it does offer, though, is a different vantage point for perceiving this relationship at this particular moment in time. And more importantly, a recognition that this is a vantage point, that there is a vantage point, and that a view from nowhere promoted by most AI designers ends up putting a very specific white, male, able-bodied, ahistorical human in the picture. So view from the window also suggests that, as well as break through the glass ceiling, digital workers or undigital workers may be ready at any time to start smashing their virtual windows. So how is that for the AI breakout that many AI researchers are scared of? And I'm moving now towards the final part of my talk. I'll be wrapping up now, and I want to kind of discuss it under the subtitle of an Uber for art. So given that the tasks required by Amazon's low-price anonymous laborers are infinite, it's understandable why artists may flock to this mechanical Turk platform. Driven by opportunism, curiosity, or a desire to unveil the hidden conditions of global labor in the digital age, they have asked MTurks to draw a sheep facing to the left that later made up a large tapestry, paint small sections of a $100 bill without realizing they were contributing to a larger picture, in every sense of the word, both projects by Aaron Koblin, photographing themselves holding a sign which revealed why they did this work by Andy Bayo, and even write poetry, work by Nick Thurston. So there's a long history of artists exploring the multiple dimensions of creativity while challenging their own singular role in the process by crowdsourcing their works, from Andrea Breton's Exquisite Corpse, which involved collectively assembling words or images, through to mail art and smart mobs. But what's new about using MTurk is that the crowdsourced art is really an outcome of extremely cheap labor undertaken by those who rely on Amazon's platform for income, rather than of playful participation in a shared activity. So the artificial intelligence of the MTurk labor force is both a representation of a labor ideal in the times of global capital flows and a premonition of things to come for the majority of workers in the majority of jobs and careers. Yet the worry that AI-driven robots will take over, that they are going to replace us, is often dismissed by techno-capitalists with the breezy reassurance that new jobs will be created, poverty diminished, and that, as a result of widespread automation, we will simply have more time. So the rebranding of unemployment and precarity as freedom sounds particularly ominous in the positive reports about the supposed desirability of the gig economy with its flexibility for all. This problem of underemployment and underpayment affects not only workers on labor sourcing platforms such as MTurk, Crowdflow, Clickworker, Toluna, or Fiverr, but also other actors of the disruptive gig economy bankrolled by Silicon Valley capital, such as Uber and Deliveroo drivers. I mean, Deliveroo drivers is the savers of the nation's kind of dinner time these days. 0 hours contract shop assistants. And last but not least, casualized academic staff. Darren Verschler's afterword to Nick Thurston's Of the Subcontract, a book of poetry commissioned via MTurk, makes an important suggestion with regard to the force of such projects. More than as a critique of a particular form of creativity with all its forms and conventions, or even the economics of MTurk, he suggests that, artists using Mechanical Turk, and in particular, he's talking here about Thurston's book of poetry, can be read as an institutional critique of the conditions of the production of art, with fame and glory attached to the singular auteur, but with the labor and infrastructure provided by a legion. And this applies to fine art made by the likes of Damien Hirst, to which, of course, there are historical antecedents predating the era of industrial capitalism, as much as it does to fashion or entertainment media. Verschler proposes to read Of the Subcontract not as a solution, but as a symptom of the age in which all sorts of activities are reconfigured as human intelligence tasks. So this goes hand in hand with the full automation of typically human creative tasks such as reporting, journalism, data analysis, with the increasing list of jobs and careers being threatened to be lost to AI. Poets and professors can point to this change, says Verschler, but so far haven't been able to move beyond it, as we are beginning to realize our tasks too can be outsourced. And again, the pandemic probably exacerbates this situation. This state of events, deemed the Uberification of the university by Gary Hall, hints at a near future in which we all become entrepreneurs of the self, with every aspect of our lives, from inhabiting a room or sleeping on someone's sofa, making friends or dating, through to walking, being monetized as a shareable good and a data point. Yet any wealth generated as part of this so-called sharing economy, writes Hall, is concentrated in the hands of relatively few, who also centrally control the platform, software, algorithm, data, and associated ecosystems, deciding on pricing and wage levels, work allocation, standards, conditions, and preferred user and laborer profiles. But Hall offers more than just a critique of the precarious labor conditions in the digital economy, or of the extension of these conditions to professional areas that were previously seen as safe from the disruptive logic of its algorithms, poets and professors. He also issues a call to arms aimed at those in higher education, highlighting that the university or the humanities or arts education provide one of the few spaces in post-industrial society where the forces of contemporary neoliberalism anti-public sector regime are still being overtly opposed. to a certain degree at least, which is why obviously governments all across the world, but in the UK, as we've seen, are getting so reluctant to increasingly to support the funding, even through not through grants, but also even through credit of humanities education. So the most important question we are posed with here is not therefore whether robots and algorithms can replace us as artists, photographers, poets, and professors. Although to answer that less important question, they surely can. By being able to produce singular artifacts that will take us in, evoke the sensation of beauty, or even sell well, and by producing online books, classes, and whole courses made up of the existing and rehashed content that will do for a while at least. The question rather is how to create conditions in which creativity with its accompanying institutions, especially those not driven by the logic of innovation, profit and capital, such as public universities, with their critical and creative subjects, such as visual culture or foreign languages, subjects that are less directly instrumental. And how can we make sure that places like art schools, state-owned galleries, museums, cultural centers still count for us embodied humans with material and other needs? So the last kind of couple of words. This defense of art practices and institutions for the human has nothing to do with residual humanism, a desire to preserve our uniqueness, sense of beauty, or any other humanist niceties of this kind. Instead, it has to do with asking poets and professors, artists and photographers to keep fighting against the uberification of the university and the art school, of knowledge production and art production. With a view from the window and the wider project of Undigital Photography, I want to show that even though we are all entangled in algorithms, it matters how we use them, what visions and vistas they are being used to produce, who will get to see them, who or what will take the picture, of what, in what circumstances, to what purpose, and for what price. Building on the legacy of the term in computer science, Undigital Photography becomes for me a way of reframing the picture after it's been taken, of refocusing and what matters, and rethinking what matters to begin with. It's also a way of seeing photography and image making as a practice that is quintessentially unfinished. And I finished making the project in 2018, but it has acquired a kind of uncanny dimension with its premonition of a world behind windows and screens in which we have all become part of a Weber-like global labor force, no matter how creative our occupations or ambitions are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanna. I offer you applause. I'm sorry we can't have applause from the whole room. I will now deliver my vote of thanks, and then I'll open the floor to the questions. So I'm asking the audience to think about your questions while I'm speaking, and then raise your hand and I'll invite you to ask a question. It is indeed my very great pleasure to thank Professor Joanna Zylinska on behalf of the RHUL Holloway and the Center for Visual Cultures that hosts the annual David Vilaseca Memorial Lecture. Thank you very much for your wonderful, insightful, and very timely engagement with the question of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and art, or visual culture in general, the culture of visuality. The form of critique your lecture and your book take is augmented by another form you mentioned in the introduction to your book, that of intrigue. And as you vividly depict the question of artificial intelligence and art is a question of the subject, the question of feasibility, the question of organization, and all these questions are deeply political. We haven't been treated very much to intrigue in politics. It has been quite blunt in the recent years. But of course, it's really important not to forget that politics runs our culture through and through, and such abstract things, seemingly abstract things like artificial intelligence or machine learning or technology in general are not neutral and cannot hide behind the facade of instrumentality. As you remind us they are all deeply political. They're embedded in larger infrastructures, whether cultural, habitual, informational, or linguistic. They are formulated and informed by platforms such as Mechanical Turk or networks. They're implicated in problems that plague the promise of automation, while in fact relying on cheap, dehumanizing labor to sustain almost all digital endeavors. In some, they're implicated in problems that define our time, but they also offer propositions, and it is great pleasure to witness you reading of such a form of politics, at least not yet fully techno-deterministic or some kind of terribly, unavoidably bleak, but open for intervention, for reformulation, for formulation of other propositions. And here is where the intrigue actually resides. And the word intrigue signifies that nothing is too simple or pre-decided. And while there is a sense of stratagems and secret alliances, it also indicates that there are complications, and where complex forces are at work, the whole is never the sum of its parts. And such non-linearity and indeterminacy of intrigue connects to the sense of intrigue as something exciting and captivating and inviting. And as you brilliantly showed, the question of the human and the technology, the question of the human as a seeing machine, is the question not only of history, but also of the future, and of the future techno-human, post-human reformulations that can bring about a different future. And what I see in your work really is a project of hope. And our only hope really is that there is a potential through reformulation, through intervention to avoid a future that kind of awaits us if we imagine that we are walking along a certain deterministic linear path. And in this sense, only the intrigue, the complexity of human technical relations can ensure a multiplicity of outcomes, can wear us around some of the disasters that lie in waiting. And it is an imperative, if you vividly kind of show and impose on us, that we are or we become, if we are not yet, intrigued and captivated and compelled to take part in such post-human reformulations. And I'm very much looking forward to your future and new reformulations of human technical, systemic, networky, apparatus-based assemblages. It is also formidable to see the intrigue built through the conceptual explication that you've offered us, and also through your artistic practice. It remains exceptionally rare to combine philosophical thinking and artistic work. Thank you very much for your work along those both lines, for developing and upholding such a capacity, which becomes a possibility for others and other things. And thank you for your lectures that combined a philosophical and an artistic talk in ways that shows these embodied propositions and reformulations in the making. I would like also to thank colleagues among in the School of the Humanities and across the college that helped organize this lecture and make this lecture happen. And with that, I would like to open the floor questions, which I will moderate. So please raise your hand and I will invite you to speak.
Yes, thank you.
You can also, if you don't have a microphone or you wouldn't like to speak, you can also type a question in the chat, and I can ask the question for you. Also, if you're a bit shy, it might be easier. We have one raised hand. Giuliana, please, could you unmute yourself? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. It was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for, you know, such a kind of rich and complex sort of set of ideas. I suppose my question is goes back to something that you said at the beginning, and I know that in fact it's a question almost like for both you and Olga, and it's about us as digital subjects and how you see this relationship evolving, and whether actually you've got any thoughts for how that relationship between us and the digital. I'm thinking about how much, you know, our kind of daily practices ever since really sort of, March last year has become sort of digitally mediated, and whether, whether you've done any thinking around these issues.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. And I think Olga is probably much better placed to answer in detail about the question of digital subjectivity, because she's done extensive work on this. But for me, the question of subjectivity here is also about a staging of something. And I think I was very taken with Olga's picking up on the phrase of intrigue. So this idea of intrigue, and you could almost say that my work is a little bit like theatre. So even though I come, theory-wise, I come from the background of philosophy and broadly humanities, it takes on a certain idea of a staging or a performance with an intrigue to it. And so even though I try to develop an argument, is also putting on stage a certain set of concerns. So it's less about predicting, what will become of us, although this question is absolutely of interest and concern to me, but it's much more about trying to understand the here and now and understand it through different senses and with different media, if you like. So it's putting it on stage, a staging and intrigue, which also will have some political consequences, but also seeing it as, while realizing this kind of technological entanglement, if you like, seeing a certain possibility of hope. So there are still ways that we can, there are things we can do, that we can work within that system. There are lots of other theories that are either completely kind of techno-hyping the new forms of subjectivity, or the theories of transhumanism, people moving on to a different state of identity, or eventually merging with machines, or their alternative kind of theories of dark vitalism, would just kind of celebrate this notion of darkness. And there is, I'm kind of suspicious of maybe both. So I think I'm just trying to almost stage this idea of what does it mean to be us? And in a way, that is a perennial question, obviously, that philosophy or humanity more broadly have asked for a very long time. What does it mean to be us? What does it mean to think? But these questions have returned now with a vengeance, if you like, with around the debates of artificial intelligence, because suddenly we've just realized we are not quite sure what intelligence is in the first place. And the same pertains to vision in machine vision. So I think that's my answer.
Thank you. There is quite a number of James, would you like to ask questions that come from the chat? And there's quite a few people saying thank you for your fascinating talk. James, do you want to speak?
Yes, thank you, Olga. I have a question from Sophia Mason, who asked, any thoughts about how far advanced AI is in China?
There is a lot of kind of work, there's a lot of financing of AI in China, because the government has given money to both private companies and the universities, and in a way pitched them against one another and see what happens. But the question is obviously huge. So I've been again intrigued what happens around technologies of machine vision. I've been interested in what happens, and some of the developments we know about. There is also a lot of collaboration between kind of Chinese scholars, scientists, engineers, and Western companies. So I don't think kind of China as itself is not a silo with its research, but there is no doubt that China is kind of in the lead when it comes to a lot of the developments. And I think even when talking about AI, and obviously I'm as guilty as charged because I've given a talk on AI and written a book on AI, but obviously then we need to break it down and look at specific developments. A lot of people working in AI actually prefer to refer to machine learning, ML. So and now we're talking then about what form of learning the production of new things, or learning as in, to repeat the behaviors that humans already have. So then we would have to go and look at some, a lot of these developments. But obviously there's AI is being implemented in some truncated form in everyday situation, in commerce, in facial recognition, and all sorts of things. So I can only answer to say that, there's definitely a lot of stuff happening. It's fascinating. Perhaps some of it is worrying. And yeah.
Thank you. I'll usurp my power and also while we're waiting for more questions. Like a small question. When I was looking at Trevor Paglen, and he did with the course this project, the Imagenet Roulette, and looking at the origin. So this is a project for people who have missed it, that was largely featured. There's an article in The Guardian, so it was active for some time, and you could take, it was an app, and you could take a picture of yourself, and it would run it through the WordNet, which is a image database used for training machine learning to recognize images, and it would give you a label of how it understands you. And I was labeled a weirdo, like a weird, unwelcome person.
I was labeled a mediatrix. It made up a word for me, and I was thinking, this is just totally amazing. This just really knows me. Mediatrix.
But then when I was looking into it, of course, as soon as you brilliantly also show, as soon as you start looking into the specific machine vision ensembles, it also strikes you how boring they are, that they are very far away from the idea, the fact that the WordNet, the ImageNet, the database, is formed of all the images harvested from Flickr, which means they're human-made images, and they are images that would look good on social media. They are not images that you would imagine, like a perfect universal machine could produce images that look at an object from like all possible angles, uncanny images. If you're like thinking of a bird, an image of a bird that a human would take, it would be not from the top of on top of the bird, because the human kind of very rarely is above the bird. So it also makes you realize how human all of these systems are, or a lot of them, and actually that maybe a more kind of technological ones would be a bit better, because the human ones just replicate all the human problems, and so there's nothing really about a lot of these systems. There's nothing too exciting and nothing really technological, because it's just the replication of human problems. So actually a bit more technology and kind of daydreaming with technology would be quite welcome. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I have to say that as a follow-up from this project, because this book is a little bit, it's a bit like a provocation. It came out, all the things I was angry about with regard to AI, and especially AI aesthetics, like I put into this book. I'm doing a kind of more extensive project now on machine vision, and I'm kind of reading early cybernetic papers. I'm reading stuff by Wiener. I'm reading things by some kind of 1980s biologists who were arguing with neuroscientists about, who is in charge of vision. But the idea is precisely what you're saying, how vision completely as if visual culture never happened. So they don't trouble themselves with all the, and I'm trying to read the early cybernetic papers, early to mid cybernetic papers, as in from this, between 60s and kind of early 90s, and read them against the kind of visual culture texts by the likes of Jonathan Pieri and Norman Bryson and others. So who taught us to understand visuality as always already having a history, having a politics, and to see that, you know, these two completely different languages. But in terms of the, you know, when it comes to the design of AI, obviously the science and the engineers have won. They do believe that there is this core of visuality, which is basically about edge detection, which shouldn't be troubled by any of these concepts that we humanities scholars like to play with. And they also think, well, yeah, you can have these, and when you have conversations with them, a lot of will admit, yeah, this happens, but at the end of the day, you return to some fantasy moment of a deeper layer, which is the core. But that core is only postulated. You can see it being made up. So it's this kind of to justify the production of the system. So it's a performative gesture of inaugurating that core, while core of visuality, I suppose core of humanity, if you like, in a way, while also creating that system. But that very gesture, the foundational gesture of the inauguration of some truncated fantasy idea of human vision that lies at the core of machine vision, is kind of obfuscated. It needs to be obscured for the system to be presented as scientific, as an engineering, you know, valid on the engineering level. So yes, absolutely. And also the boring notion of you know, machine vision as being completely static and premised on just the body that doesn't move and just sees edges and contrasts, rather than a vision being produced as, you know, by the body in the world, by the body moving in the world. And for that, you know, so also as a result of this, you know, self-driving cars not coming anytime soon, people, contrary to what you might have heard.
I'm looking forward to your new project. James, would you like to ask some more questions that come in the chat, please?
Yeah, sure. As a message from Bryce Lees, could you tell us, Joanna, a little more about which artists you highlight throughout the book, either those whose work is subversive or problematic?
Well, I look at the book started from the moment of irritation of going to kind of art festivals in 2017, and a great outpouring of so-called kind of creativity by kind of GAN network, generative adversarial networks. And especially with a particular bunch of boys from the engineering camp that suddenly they were very good at programming, probably not very good at art, but they started producing all these things that looked like screensavers. And saying, well, look, isn't it amazing? The computer now creates soon human. And then they did all these competitions trying to show something that looked a bit like cheap Francis Bacon, and showing them to you know, art experts and saying, what do you think? Is it real art or not? And then saying, haha, it was made by a computer. So that joke kind of wore thin, except there was a great fascination. And what was fascinating for me was the stories that were being told about these artifacts. Now, I do think that GANs, these generative adversarial networks, which is kind of you know, one way of machine learning around machine vision. It's a guy called Gene Kogan who does a lot of training. It's a very nice project. He does training for artists for free, puts lots of free videos. I mean, I've learned a lot from him and his videos. So there is, but at the same time, in terms of controlling or curating the debate on creativity, the kind of engineering boys and Google boys got there first, and that kind of slightly upset me in a way, because again, it's went behind or outside all the more complex debates around culture, around visuality, about politics that have happened, you know, as if so. But I also try and look at the history of kind of AI art, looking at some fascinating developments in robot art, then also the net art. And so a lot of other developments that I think are conceptually linked with that. I also look at people like, you know, Pieri, who had an exhibition at the Serpentine, who I think is doing something fascinating with GAN networks and machine vision, but also one of my favorite artists, modern artist, Katya Novitskova, an Estonian artist who doesn't do AI as such, although there might be aspects, but I'm trying to read her work as being an art for another intelligence, art for another AI. It's a term that actually was proposed by a theorist, Licker Tonnenberg, I think. So there's quite a few different directions, both towards the past and towards the future.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question, and in fact, it's two questions. from Sophia again. So the first, can you talk more about the finding that AI likes sunsets? And mindful of Extinction Rebellion, how does the climate catastrophe impact the future of AI?
Mm-hmm. Well, with regard to the second question, there's a whole chapter in the book on this. You know, when the oceans kind of rise, and the Silicon Valley boys are the first to go because they're quite close to the coast. So they haven't really, they're really trying to prepare for the kind of AI apocalypse. And I think they should be better off. They would be better off thinking about the other side. So that's my message to. But the first question was about. Sorry, can you remind me? Because my brain.
Yeah, you're finding that AI likes sunsets.
Okay. Yes. Well, I think it kind of goes back to the discussion I was having with Olga. I mean, I think it likes sunsets because the data set that it got trained on was probably sunsets, because there's a lot of sunset on Flickr. When Penelope Umbrico did a beautiful art project called Sunsets from Flickr. So there's a lot of sunsets, it got trained on it, but also sunsets have very contrasty colors. So AI kind of recognizes contrasts because that was the easy way to train. And because sunsets have both contrasts and big availability of data, I think that's why it ended up liking it. I mean, humans like color red, and some unreformed versions of human art history that kind of, you know, try to do neuro art history outside any cultural dimension also have said some interesting things about color red. And I think a lot of interesting things could be said about color red, but I'm kind of not that intrigued by just the neurological reactions. So I think it's mainly with this, it's about you know, the data sets and the fact that a lot of humans like sunsets. Hey, James got a very nice sunset behind him.
Yes.
I like sunsets.
I didn't take the image. I have to say, a student took it of Seville, so it's nothing to do with me. But
well, I like sunsets. You know, don't get me
it is
wrong.
intriguing.
I like a nice sunset.
All right, I think we don't have any more questions, and I would like to conclude by extending our appreciation once again to Professor Joanna Zylinska for her captivating David Vilaseca Memorial Lecture, to all of you for attending via this uneasy medium, for all your questions. And we would normally be able to continue this discussion with the drinks. So I would like to raise a virtual glass in memory of David Vilaseca, this virtual glass. Also to Joanna and to you all, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation and for the conversation. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you, Joanna and
Thank
Giuliana. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Everyone's thanking you, Joanna, in the chat. I'm sure you can.
That's very nice. Thank you. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to close the meeting now.
Neil, can I just have a quick word with you?
Yeah.
Oh, why is she waiting in the lobby?
I don't know. No,
so yes, I'm not quite sure what happened with my slide.
No, that's all right.
Could you see everything that was on my screen?
Let me just stop recording.
Oh yes.